Hey everyone, Jamie Holroyd here. In this video I'd like to help you get motivated to read music and practice reading sheet music on the guitar. I believe it's a valuable, underestimated skill and it's often neglected by jazz guitar players and electric guitar players, so I'd like to share with you some tips and tricks that make it a much more enjoyable experience. I'm sure you've all heard the joke, how do you make an electric guitar player turn down? Give him some sheet music. Well, let's try and stop those myths from occurring frequently and deal with our reading and make it an enjoyable and positive experience. Just before we begin the video, I'd like to tell you about a free beginner jazz guitar course which I have available for anyone that is new to learning jazz guitar. I've put this jazz guitar course together to break down jazz guitar in a coherent and structured way. There are over 25 4K video lessons and a 40-page downloadable PDF to help you get started. Each module comes with downloadable PDFs, chord diagrams, etudes and studies to help you get started learning the wonderful art of jazz. The first way in which you can make reading a more enjoyable experience, in my opinion, is to go beyond classical guitar repertoire. So the reason why I mention classical guitar is whenever you start reading music and you start learning to read on, say, one or two strings, some of the old kind of classical tunes start to come up, like Ode to Joy, Minuet, those type of things, which are all great, and you might even have basic versions of these for classical guitar arrangements which have bass notes, which I'm not condemning and I'm not saying don't practice. What I am saying is once you get beyond a certain level, then it really is good to kind of go beyond classical guitar. Classical guitar is great, but whenever you're kind of reading that, it almost tends to be hard to kind of sight read classical guitar material because you've always got bass notes and multiple notes to read. And of course there are quicker ways of breaking those down and getting good at that, but generally speaking I think it's a little bit cumbersome. If your main interest is to be an electric sight reader and you want to really play things like jazz guitar and be able to kind of get into transcribing and reading lead sheets, then I think you're much more better off with music that's written for instruments such as violin, the flute, clarinet, treble recorder. It's one of those things where you're just dealing with a treble clef really, and you're just dealing with single line instruments, at least for the most part. You sometimes hear violinists play a couple of notes, but generally speaking there is a lot of single line material. So I would really recommend checking out a few resources for those instruments. To give you a brief example, here's a very short snippet from a Bach violin sonata, which I basically just kind of arranged for guitar a little bit. I believe the original recording of this is actually in 16th notes, but just for recording's sake I've written it out in 8th notes. So this is, like I said, a violin piece, but listen to how nice it sounds when it's played on the electric guitar. The second thing which I think that you need to do to make reading an enjoyable experience is to mix up more difficult pieces and easier pieces. So, for example, the piece that you've just heard there, the violin sonata, I would consider that to be a very difficult piece. If you want to play that in 16th notes at the tempo which it was meant to be played at, then it would take many months, I think, to be able to kind of achieve that. So if your only sheet music is really difficult pieces like that, then that could be discouraging. So what you want to do is have much easier pieces to work on as well. You're going to get a much better sense of accomplishment if you can have, I don't know, even if it's just an 8-bar piece of music or a 12-bar piece of music which is simpler, which you can get through with just maybe a week's worth of practice or a couple of days or even less. Then it's very important to keep that balance, to keep your confidence going with a skill like reading music. The third way which you can make reading music a more excitable and enjoyable experience is to practice it with a friend. However, if you don't have any friends, then, or if you don't have any friends that play guitar or play music or read music, then there's a couple of ways which you can get around that. One of which is to use a loop pedal, or another is to use a DAW, which is basically a recording station, and you can record 2, 3, 4-part guitars and you can get music for 2 guitars or 3 guitars, and you can record all of these by yourself. It recreates a live situation very well. It gives you the pressure of needing to actually record yourself, and it's very fun and very enjoyable to do. In fact, you don't even need a loop pedal actually. You could just record one of the parts on your phone and then play along with the second part, and that would also do the job. Here's a brief example of, I think it's Bach's 4th invention, which I've basically recorded for 2 guitars, and the extract for this is from an excellent book which I'll give you the reference for later on in the video. The next tip which I like to share with you is to try and avoid standards in the real book which were basically written with words in mind. So things like autumn leaves or all the things you are, if you ever look at the lead sheets for those, they're pretty dry and rhythmically not that satisfying to read. Don't get me wrong, it's good to be able to sight read any tune in the real book in case they're called at gigs and you don't know them. But in my personal experience and with the experience of students, they're not really that engaging to read, because I'm sure if you've ever learnt the melody to Autumn Leaves or any jazz standard, you generally need to kind of add some ornamentation to it, add some dynamics, and no one really plays something like Autumn Leaves as it's written in the real book. However, what I do strongly recommend is music by jazz musicians which was meant to be written as an instrumental piece. So music by people like Dave Brubeck, Paul Desmond, Wes Montgomery, Charlie Parker, not the solos which they play in the songs, the heads, the themes, things like Billy's Bounce, Ornithology, Take 5, 4 on 6, things like that are not as difficult as reading full-on transcriptions, but they sound much better straight off a lead sheet than what something like Autumn Leaves will do, and it will hopefully be much more motivating to practice. Whilst we're on the subject of jazz transcriptions, written solos can be often quite awkward to read. Even if you're a good reader, it's quite hard to get all the information from a transcription and make it sound as you would want it to. More often than not, you're really going to have to be listening to the recording anyway to get an accurate rendition of the transcription, even if you can play it as it is written on the score. So I don't really consider jazz transcriptions a great reference. I think that picking out lines and things like that is okay. That's probably not a bad idea. What I do strongly recommend though are things called jazz etudes. So jazz etudes are things that were written for the purpose of study. So, books by people like Jerry Begonzi are fantastic, but the one that I recommend for guitar players is one by Joe Pass called Joe Pass Guitar Style. So here's a little segment from one of his rhythm changes solos, and the good thing about this is that it's rhythmically all consistent, but there's lots of kind of accidentals in this. It's technically in B flat, but when you're reading kind of jazz solos and stuff, there tends to be lots of chromatic notes, which makes it challenging to read but very fun. And because it's an etude, it's designed to be able to be played without that much interpretation and sound good. The next tip which I'd like to share with you is to go through music grade books. Music grades seem to be more popular in the UK than other countries, although in recent years they seem to really be expanding. Long story short, grades are kind of a subjective thing and certainly better for a video in their own right, but generally speaking it's a good way to order music in terms of difficulty from complete beginner to intermediate to basically kind of semi-professional. So you start at grade 1 and by the time you're grade 8, then here in the UK you're generally ready to take up a degree in music. So they give you a lot of structure and I'm a big fan of using them, especially when it comes to reading music. So for example, what I'm going to do now is just play you a piece which is from a grade 1 violin book on the guitar obviously, and you can hear how that sounds. It's going to be quite a simple piece, but Equally, if you're brand new to reading music, this is exactly something that you want to start with. You don't want to be starting with something complex, you want something like this. So let's have a listen to this piece now. It's simple, but in my opinion, it sounds pretty good as well. So you get an idea of how grades work. Here's another famous piece which is actually from a grade 3 syllabus, so you can hear that this time it's a little bit more complex. There's some 16th notes, the tempo is probably a little bit quicker. It's slightly more difficult than what you've just heard, which was a grade 1 piece, and that's a good thing about following grades, is that you get kind of difficulty of music and you're actually getting proper music to play, not just kind of generic exercises which are great. If you want to get a book which has got lots of exercises just to play through them, just for the pure technique and skill, that's good. But it kind of, unless you play music, then in my personal experience, that can get a little bit boring sometimes. So I'd much rather be reading something that sounds great, training my ears and playing beautiful music, rather than just kind of generic C major scale exercises. The last tip which I like to share with you is to work on complex rhythms separately. In my opinion, just getting pitch and reading pitch and being able to be a somewhat half-decent sight reader is kind of a big task on its own for guitar players. We have all these positions that we need to be able to read music in, ideally all 12 keys. And if you try and put complicated rhythms to read in different time signatures on top of that, then that could be very discouraging if you haven't got the first element of that down, which is why I recommend strongly a book by Louis Bellson called Modern Reading in 4/4, which is basically a book written by a jazz drummer, and it's all rhythm, all clapping exercises. This will definitely get your rhythm skills up to scratch, and I would recommend working on that separately, and then by that point, hopefully your general reading will be pretty good. So if you're looking at something which is a little bit more complex, which has 16th notes, 32nd notes, things like that, then you'll be much more skilled and much more confident at dealing with musical repertoire, having dealt with rhythm separately. So those are my main tips. I hope that they help you out. What I'd like to do is just finish with a few quick reading book recommendations, both personal ones that I've mentioned in the video and ones that have worked very well with students, just in case you're looking to kind of take music seriously and you want to check out any of the examples that you've heard in this lesson in a more detailed study. The first book which I recommend is called Progressive Guitar Method. Progressive Guitar Method. This is basically for you if you have never learn to read music before. This is where you need to start. This is the book which I've used lots of times with students of all ages, kids, teenagers and adults, and it's worked wonderfully, and it's just a very good methodical start to learning to read music. I'm not going to lie, it's not exactly the most engaging. When you start learning reading music, the pieces are not completely engaging and great because, for example, you're only going to be learning to read 1 or 2 notes at a time. So there's only so many songs that can be created with 1 or 2 notes. But if you stick with the book towards the end of it, then there are some nice songs that you can play when you learn to read all of the notes. But you need a book like this to get started. They're all basically the same. I recommend this book just because I'm confident with it, but there's several books by publishers like Mel Bay and Hal Leonard, generally marketed as beginner guitar books, which will get you reading notation. So you need something like that if you're completely new to reading music, just to get the basics down. Another book which I really highly recommend is called Reading Music by David Oates. This one is a really fantastic bigger book which kind of gives you lots of different skills. So this one actually, rather than kind of start in open position as many guitar books does, starts in 5th position. So if you're kind of like an intermediate or an advanced guitar player, then this one is kind of a cracking book to get started with, really. It's got lots of beautiful classical music examples and lots of different elements of music broken down. So it's a really good book. The only thing I will say about this is sometimes it almost makes more sense to keep it as a reference book, because there's so many chapters to it, so you're not quite going to get that sense of completion if you start with this book. I mean, you could do if you're very determined and you stick with this book for like, you know, several months, but you know, from my experience as a guitar teacher, that is usually quite unlikely. But if you just kind of have it as one of those books that you come to every now and again, then you can't really go wrong with that book. The next types of books which I recommend are what I refer to as grade books. Now, if you're looking at standard sheet music and treble clef, then there are two basic kind of big exam boards here in the UK, one of which is called Trinity and the other is ABRSM. ABRSM. And each of those companies have basically grade books for classical guitar, flute, violin, treble clef instruments, which are fantastic to work through. Very methodical, lots of great music, catchy songs in them. So I would recommend, you know, any of them are good. Violin, flute, as I said in the beginning, I prefer ones for single line instruments to really focus on treble clef as opposed to classical guitar. But, you know, classical guitar grades are certainly not a bad thing. Those are what I would recommend as a resource. So maybe, you know, just start with grade 1, see if you can play through that, and once you've done that, then move on to grade 2. And if you stick with those over a period of months, they will definitely kind of help you work on your reading in a very structured and methodical manner. The next book is Modern Time by Louis Bellson. I've already talked about this quite a bit, but I thought I'd just kind of include it here because it's a very, very important book to get. It's all about reading rhythms. It starts with eighth notes, syncopated eighth notes. Then it goes to sixteenths. If you're in doubt about that one, just get that because as a guitar player, even if you're not massively into reading pitches, reading rhythms is something that's very important. And if you want to be a good accompanist, then you need to be able to read a lot of rhythm charts anyway. And even if you don't want to do that, if you just want to be a good accompanist and you want to be able to hear and feel rhythm on different beats of the bar, then it's pretty fundamental musicianship is this one. So even if you're not massively into reading and you just want to improve your musicianship, your sense of time, then modern reading is an absolute must. The last book recommendation, which I'll say for now, is the Joe Pass Guitar Style book. A wonderful book by Joe Pass and Bill Thrasher. This one should be a must anyway regardless, but the good thing about this is that it's all in standard notation. You have some wonderful etudes written out by Joe, some lines and phrases throughout the book, some chords. It's a really fantastic piece to have in your library if you want to work on your reading. So I hope that these tips help you out and make you feel motivated to read music. What are some of your favourite reading resources and tips? Please share them in the comment section below. And if you found this video useful, then please subscribe to this channel for more videos like this.